As historians examine the extraordinary artifacts within a mysterious 1920s cellar discovered beneath a struggling Montana ranch, they realize this isn't just a time capsule. It's evidence of a hidden chapter in American history that could rewrite our understanding of the Prohibition era and make this failing ranch the most significant historical site of the decade. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by hidden historical discoveries, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we have an even more amazing revelation to share with you. Deep in the rugged terrain of Montana's Bitterroot Valley, where generations of ranchers had worked the land since the frontier days, Tom Reeves stood frozen at the entrance of what appeared to be an ancient cellar door. The late autumn wind whistled through the weathered pines as his flashlight beam illuminated something that shouldn't exist according to any of his ranch's historical records. The bitter November cold bit through his worn leather jacket, but he barely noticed, his attention completely fixed on the impossible discovery before him. The unseasonably heavy rains that had threatened to bankrupt his struggling cattle operation had eroded away decades of packed soil near the old north pasture, revealing heavy timber doors reinforced with antique iron hardware. The craftsmanship was unlike anything he'd seen in other historical buildings from the region, but it was the intricate symbol carved into the wood that made his heart race. A distinctive mark he recognized from his years studying American folk history at the University of Montana before returning home to save his family's legacy. The morning had started like any other at Whispering Pines Ranch. Tom had risen before dawn, his mind heavy with worry about the upcoming bank meeting. The recent storms had devastated his winter pastures, forcing him to buy expensive feed for his cattle. The ranch's finances, already strained from 3 years of drought, couldn't take much more. His small herd of prize Angus cattle, carefully bred over generations, was all that stood between him and complete financial ruin. He'd been checking the erosion damage from last night's downpour when his boots had struck something solid where there should have been only soil. 20 minutes of frantic digging had revealed the cellar doors, their existence somehow erased from every map and document in the ranch's extensive records. The discovery made no sense. The Reeves family had worked this land since 1885, and Tom had grown up hearing every story, every detail about the ranch's history from his grandfather, who'd been almost obsessive about documenting the property's past. Now, as his flashlight beam played across the weathered wood, Tom noticed more details that set his historian's mind racing. The hardware wasn't just old. It was custom-made, featuring designs he'd only seen in photographs of high-end speakeasies from the height of Prohibition. The symbol carved into the door, partially obscured by decades of dirt, was one he'd written about in his graduate thesis, a marker used by an exclusive network of sophisticated bootleggers who'd operated throughout the Northwest. But this location made no sense. His research had suggested their operations had never extended this far into Montana's remote valleys. The official histories placed their activities closer to the Canadian border, hundreds of miles north. If this cellar was what he suspected, it could rewrite the accepted narrative of how Prohibition had shaped the American West. What he would discover beyond those doors would challenge everything historians thought they knew about America's Prohibition era, and transform his failing ranch into the centerpiece of a mystery that had remained buried for nearly a century. As his trembling hands reached for the ancient padlock, Tom had no way of knowing that this moment would not only save his family's 6th-generation ranch, but would unveil secrets that powerful people had worked very hard to keep hidden. The early morning fog clung to the valley floor as Tom's flashlight beam cut through decades of darkness, revealing rows of shelves that stretched into the shadows. The air that escaped as he pulled the doors open carried the musty sweetness of aged wood and something else, a complex blend of aromas that made his expert nose tingle with recognition. His years of historical research had taught him to identify the subtle sense of different spirits, a skill that had impressed his professors but seemed impractical until this moment. But it wasn't just another bootlegger's hideout that he'd stumbled upon. What he saw in that cellar would leave historians and researchers speechless and raise questions about everything we thought we knew about a pivotal era in American history. The shelves held more than just bottles and barrels. As Tom's light illuminated the chamber's contents, he realized he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Evidence of an operation far more sophisticated and extensive than any historian had believed possible in this region. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Marcus Wheeler, his ranch foreman, wondering why he hadn't shown up to help with the morning feeding. Tom had a decision to make. Report his discovery immediately, risking a circus of historians and media that could disrupt his struggling ranch operations, or take time to understand what he'd found first. Either choice could change everything. For Whispering Pines Ranch, for better or worse. Thomas Reeves' connection to Whispering Pines Ranch ran as deep as the mountain springs that fed the property's fertile valleys. For 6 generations, the Reeves family had worked this challenging terrain, transforming a modest homestead claim into one of Montana's most respected cattle operations. Their 2,000-acre ranch, nestled against the rugged backdrop of the Bitterroot Mountains, had been a symbol of ranching innovation since his great-great-grandfather first staked his claim in 1885. But lately, the proud legacy was slipping through, his fingers like the eroded soil that had revealed the mysterious cellar. At 35, Tom's weathered face and the constant tension in his shoulders told the story of someone who had traded a promising academic career for the grueling demands of ranch life. 3 years ago, he had been on track for a tenure position in the history department at the University of Montana, his research on Prohibition-era organized crime in the American Northwest earning him recognition in academic circles. The transformation of Dr. Thomas Reeves, PhD candidate, into Tom Reeves, struggling rancher, hadn't been part of his plan. Growing up, he'd loved the ranch, but dreamed of uncovering the hidden stories of Montana's past. His father, James Reeves, had supported his academic pursuits, proud to have a historian in the family. Understanding history makes you a better rancher, he'd always said, encouraging Tom to pursue his studies while keeping his connection to Whispering Pines alive. Just 4 years ago, the ranch had been thriving. His father's innovative breeding program had developed a line of Angus cattle, particularly well suited to Montana's harsh climate, and their beef commanded premium prices from high-end restaurants across the Pacific Northwest. The Reeves bloodline was famous in ranching circles, known for producing cattle with exceptional marbling and remarkable hardiness. Local agricultural students would visit to learn about their sustainable ranching practices, and the ranch's annual income had been enough to support 3 families comfortably. But then everything changed. His father's unexpected stroke had forced Tom to leave his position at the university and take over the ranch. The transition had been brutal. Despite his childhood experience, managing a large-scale cattle operation required a different set of skills than researching historical documents. The learning curve had been steep, and expensive mistakes were made in those early months. Then the real troubles began. A devastating drought had gripped the region for 3 years running, dramatically, reducing their grazing capacity. The veterinary bills had mounted as the stressed cattle became more susceptible to disease. Tom had watched helplessly as their herd size dropped to less than half its previous numbers, while operating costs continued to climb. He'd employed every bit of his analytical training to solve the problems, studying weather patterns, soil conditions, and market trends, but found no clear path forward. He'd been forced to lay off most of his ranch hands, trusted workers who had been with the family for years. The decision had torn at his heart, but with bank payments looming and equipment repairs eating into their reserves, he'd had no choice. Now it was just him and Marcus Wheeler, who'd worked alongside his father for 20 years and refused to abandon the ranch, despite Tom's inability to pay him full wages. The local community had watched Whispering Pines decline with growing concern. The Reeves name meant something. In these parts, his grandfather had helped establish the county's first ranchers' cooperative, and his father had served on the state's Agricultural Advisory Board. Last week, Sarah Martinez, the regional bank manager who handled their loans, had called Tom in for a meeting. The conversation still echoed in his mind. "Tom, you've got until the end of the quarter to get current on your payments. I've pushed this as far as I can with the board, but if something doesn't change..." The unfinished sentence had hung in the air like the morning fog that now shrouded his mysterious discovery. 3 more months. That's all he had to save 6 generations of Reeves history. Tom had tried everything he could think of. He'd applied for agricultural assistance programs, consulted with extension agents, and even considered converting to organic certification in hopes of commanding higher prices. But each potential solution required time or capital he didn't have, and the bank's deadline loomed ever closer. His father's life insurance had helped cover some of the initial losses, but that cushion was long gone. The recent rains that had revealed the cellar couldn't have come at a worse time. The erosion had damaged crucial winter pastures, forcing him to consider selling off more of their precious breeding stock just to afford feed for the remaining cattle. The discovery of the cellar presented an impossible timing, both a potential lifeline and a complication he couldn't afford. His historian's training told him the site could be of immense historical significance, but his rancher's practicality warned that any disruption to their daily operations could be the final push toward bankruptcy. Marcus's old truck was rattling. Down the access road now, Tom could hear its distinctive engine sound echoing across the morning silence. His foreman would want to know why he hadn't shown up for the morning feeding, and Tom would have to decide whether to share his discovery. Marcus was like family, but could he ask him to keep something this extraordinary a secret? Standing at the entrance to the mysterious cellar, Tom felt the weight of both his academic training and his family legacy pressing down on him. The contents of this underground chamber could change everything, but would that change save or destroy what remained of Whispering Pines Ranch? As Marcus's truck drew closer, Tom realized he had only moments to make a decision that would affect not just his family's legacy, but potentially the entire historical record of America's Prohibition era. Tom's decision was made for him as Marcus's boots crunched on the gravel behind him. The older man's sharp intake of breath told Tom he'd spotted the open cellar doors. "Sweet Jesus," Marcus whispered, his weathered face illuminated by Tom's flashlight beam. His calloused hand gripped the ancient wooden doorframe for support. As he took in the impossible scene before them, "How long has this been here?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying decades of ranching experience. Tom quickly explained the morning's discovery, watching as his foreman's expression shifted from shock to intense curiosity. To Tom's surprise, Marcus didn't immediately suggest calling authorities or historical societies. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old leather notebook. "Your grandfather gave me this when I first started working here," Marcus said, flipping through pages yellow with age. "Said it contained everything I needed to know about the ranch's history." He stopped at a page and held it up. There, in faded ink, was a rough sketch of a symbol, the same intricate design carved into the cellar door. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he took the notebook. His grandfather had never mentioned this to him, despite knowing his passionate interest in the region's history. The page was dated June 1963, with a cryptic note, "Keep this safe, the time isn't right yet." Together they descended the sturdy wooden stairs into the cellar. The space was larger than Tom's initial glimpse had suggested, stretching back into the hillside, at least 50 feet. The air was surprisingly dry and cool, preserved by what appeared to be an ingenious ventilation system built into the walls. Their flashlight beams revealed rows of shelves, but it wasn't the expected cache of bootlegged liquor that caught their attention. "This is impossible," Tom breathed, moving closer to examine the nearest shelf, alongside bottles of clearly valuable vintage spirits were leather-bound ledgers, stacks of documents, and what appeared to be early photographic equipment. But it was the quality and organization of everything that struck him. This was no ordinary bootlegger's stash. Each bottle was meticulously labeled with dates, locations, and what appeared to be code numbers. The ledgers, at first glance, contained far more than simple shipment records. Tom's trained eye recognized names of prominent historical figures, detailed maps of rail lines and shipping routes, and what appeared to be encrypted messages. "Look at this," Marcus called from deeper in the cellar. He was standing before a large wooden cabinet. When they opened it, both men fell silent. Inside were dozens of leather cases containing photographic plates, each carefully preserved and dated. The images they could make out showed scenes from across the American Northwest during Prohibition, but not the usual shots of raiders and smugglers. These photographs documented something else entirely: meetings between supposed adversaries, handshakes between known Prohibition agents and notorious bootleggers, and social gatherings that, according to official history, could never have taken place. "This isn't just a bootlegger's hideout," Tom said, his historian's mind racing. "This was an intelligence-gathering operation. These people weren't just smuggling liquor, they were collecting information." He carefully examined one of the ledgers, its pages filled with detailed notes about movements of people and goods across the Canadian border. Marcus whistled low as he held up an ornate bottle. "This ain't rot-gut whiskey either. This is the good stuff, the kind they served in those fancy Chicago speakeasies." The bottle's label bore the same symbol as the cellar door, along with the date, 1924. As they explored further, they discovered more evidence that this operation was far more sophisticated than anything historians had documented in the region. There was early radio equipment, custom-made tools for bottling and labeling, and most intriguingly, what appeared to be a primitive telegraph system built into the walls. "Your grandfather must have known about this," Marcus said, gesturing to his notebook. "Question is, why didn't he tell anyone, and why leave me that note about the time isn't right yet?" Tom was about to respond when his flashlight beam caught something that made his blood run cold. In a far corner, partially hidden, behind a shelf, was a steel safe. Unlike everything else in the cellar, this looked modern, probably installed sometime in the 1960s. On its door was a plate bearing a familiar name: J.D. Reeves, his grandfather. "Marcus," Tom said slowly, "I think my grandfather didn't just know about this place. I think he was protecting it." He ran his fingers over the safe's combination dial. "And I think he left us more than just that symbol in your notebook." They spent the next hour documenting everything with Tom's phone camera, being careful not to disturb any of the artifacts. The historian in him knew this discovery could be worth a fortune to the right institutions. The pristine condition of everything, the detailed documentation, the photographic evidence, it was a historian's dream. But as Tom photographed another shelf of documents, he noticed something that complicated matters even further. Many of the papers bore official government seals, some from agencies that, according to his research, hadn't officially existed during Prohibition. This wasn't just historical evidence. This could be politically sensitive information that had been deliberately hidden. "We need to think this through carefully," Marcus said, voicing Tom's own concerns. "This isn't just about saving the ranch anymore. Whatever your grandfather was protecting, whatever got him that safe, it's bigger than that." Tom nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. The bank deadline still loomed, but now he had something else to consider. His grandfather had chosen to keep this place secret for decades, even from his own family. There had to be a reason, and that reason might be documented somewhere in this underground archive. As they carefully closed the cellar doors and concealed them again with loose soil, Tom made a decision. He would give himself 1 week to research the contents of the cellar before deciding how to proceed. His academic training would finally serve a practical purpose, helping him understand exactly what his family had been guarding all these years. What he couldn't know was that his grandfather's old notebook contained more than just that simple symbol, and that the safe in the corner held secrets that would challenge not just historical records, but the very foundations of power in the modern Northwest. The next 3 days became an intricate dance of secrecy and scholarly investigation. Each morning, Tom would rise before dawn, his heart racing as he made his way to the cellar, half afraid he'd find it discovered or, worse, emptied of its precious contents. But each morning, the heavy doors remained undisturbed, concealing their extraordinary secrets. His old research skills came flooding back as he established a makeshift study area in his father's old office. He'd retrieved his laptop and portable scanner from storage, along with other equipment he'd kept from his academic days. The cellar's contents seemed to accept his presence, yielding their secrets, one document at a time, to his careful examination. The most extraordinary development came on the second morning, when Tom began cross-referencing the ledgers with his grandfather's notebook. "Entry log day 2, he spoke into his digital recorder, examining a series of entries from 1924. "The ledgers contain unprecedented details about what appears to be a vast intelligence network operating throughout the Northwest during Prohibition. But these weren't just bootleggers. They were gathering information about something much bigger. What fascinated Tom most was the sophisticated coding system used throughout the documents. His years of studying historical cryptography were finally proving useful as he began to decipher the patterns. The bottles themselves weren't just valuable spirits. They were a cover for an elaborate communication system. "Look at this," he explained to Marcus, who had become his trusted partner in the investigation. Tom held up one of the ornate bottles, its label bearing both the mysterious symbol and a series of numbers. "These aren't just batch numbers. They're coordinates and dates. Every bottle was a message in itself, telling recipients where to find more detailed information." Marcus, who had taken to keeping watch while Tom worked, studied the bottle with newfound appreciation. "Your grandfather used to talk about how Prohibition wasn't what the history books made it out to be. Guess he knew more than he was letting on." The deeper they dug, the more complex the picture became. The photographic plates revealed meetings between figures whose official histories placed them hundreds of miles apart. Government agents, supposed bootleggers, and prominent business leaders appeared in social settings that contradicted every accepted historical narrative about the era. But it was the discovery he made on the third day that truly shook his understanding of what they were dealing with. Hidden behind a false panel in one of the shelving units, Tom found a series of documents that made his blood run cold. They weren't just records of bootlegging operations. They were evidence of a massive conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of 1920s society. "These people weren't just evading Prohibition," Tom whispered, scanning another document into his laptop. "They were using it as cover for something much bigger. Look at these shipping manifests. The amounts don't match. They were moving something else entirely under the guise of bootlegged spirits." The telegraph system built into the cellars Walls proved to be even more sophisticated than they'd initially thought. Tom's careful examination revealed it was part of a larger network, with connections that supposedly ran throughout the Northwest. The technology was decades ahead of what should have been available in the 1920s. "Your grandfather's notes mention something about the network," Marcus said, studying the old leather notebook. "Says here they had stations like this one all across the territory, disguised as bootlegging operations. But what were they really doing? The pressure of maintaining their secret was starting to wear on both men. That afternoon, they'd had to turn away a cattle buyer who had shown unexpected interest in the north pasture where the cellar was located. The local historical society had called twice, curious about rumors of unusual activity at the ranch. Each inquiry required careful deflection, and Tom found himself constructing an increasingly complex web of half-truths. His isolation was taking its toll. There were so many questions he needed to discuss with other historians, so many connections. He could see forming, but couldn't quite confirm without access to other archives. The cellar's contents could revolutionize our understanding of not just Prohibition, but the entire power structure of the early 20th century Northwest. But every time he considered reaching out to his old colleagues, he remembered his grandfather's warning in Marcus's notebook, "The time isn't right yet." What had the old man known? What was he waiting for? Late on the third night, Tom sat in his father's office, surrounded by scans of documents and photographs, watching as his computer compiled another batch of decoded messages. The ranch's financial deadline still loomed, but it seemed almost insignificant now compared to the weight of the historical mystery unfolding before him. "I wish you could tell me exactly what you were protecting, Grandpa," he said softly, studying another photograph of men whose faces he recognized from his historical research. Men who, according to official records, should never have been in the same room together. To his surprise, his grandfather might have left him exactly that answer. As Tom flipped through another section of Marcus's notebook, he noticed something he'd missed before. The pages weren't just filled with notes. There were subtle marks in the corners, the same kind of coding system used in the ledgers. His hands shook as he began applying the cipher he'd broken earlier. The message hidden in the notebook's margins was clear. When the right person finds the cellar, they'll know how to open the safe. Look for the pattern, not the numbers. Tom's eyes darted to the modern safe they'd discovered, with its seemingly ordinary combination lock. He'd been approaching it all wrong. It wasn't about finding the right numbers. The answer was in the pattern. The same pattern that appeared on the cellar door, the bottles, and throughout his grandfather's coded messages. But before he could process the implications of this revelation, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside the office. His heart stopped as he recognized the sound of multiple vehicles approaching. The headlights swept across his window, illuminating the room with an eerie glow. He had seconds to decide: hide everything or finally let others in on a secret that had been kept for nearly a century. The crisis struck with devastating suddenness. Tom had barely managed to close his laptop when he noticed 3 unfamiliar vehicles parked at the ranch's entrance. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized the logo on one of them, the Montana Historical Society. As he approached, he could hear Marcus's voice carrying across the evening air, trying to deflect the visitors' questions. But it wasn't just historians who had arrived. A local news crew was setting up their equipment, and a sleek black SUV had pulled up behind them. "Mr. Reeves," called out Dr. Catherine Morrison, the state's leading expert on Prohibition-era history, whom Tom had once cited in his own studies. "We've received some very interesting information about unusual activities and possible historical artifacts on your property. We'd like to discuss what's happening here." Before Tom could respond, a familiar voice cut through the gathering crowd. "Tom, what's going on here?" Sarah Martinez, his bank manager, stepped out of her car, waving a stack of papers. I've been trying to reach you all day. We need to discuss some unusual activity in your accounts." Tom's mind raced. How had they found out? He'd been careful, hadn't he? But as more vehicles arrived, local history buffs, additional media, and what looked like government officials, he realized keeping this secret was no longer an option. His phone buzzed continuously. Messages from former colleagues, agricultural authorities, even his old thesis advisor. Inside his office, the scans of the CELLAR's documents seemed to mock him from his computer screen. Marcus appeared at his side, his expression grim. "They're saying someone spotted lights in the north pasture last night. Got photos of us going in and out of the cellar." Dr. Morrison was already striding toward the office, her team following with cameras and scanning equipment. "This is private property," Tom called out, trying to maintain control of the situation, but he could see it slipping away as more people arrived. His phone buzzed again. The local Historical Preservation Society, the County Records Office, the State Archaeology Department, but it was the tall man in the black suit who caught Tom's attention. He had emerged from the government SUV and was speaking quietly into a phone, his expression intense. The man's bearing screamed federal agent, but not the usual kind. This was someone used to handling sensitive situations. "Mr. Reeves," the man said, approaching with measured steps. "I'm Special Agent David Chen, Historical Archives and Preservation Division. We need to talk about what you've found." He showed credentials Tom had never seen before, from an agency he didn't know existed. Tom felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Marcus stood by his side, his steady presence offering silent support as he faced the moment he'd been dreading. But before he could respond, something happened that changed everything. Dr. Morrison, who had been examining the photographs visible on Tom's computer screen, suddenly gasped. "That man," she said, pointing to one of the figures in an old cellar. "Photograph. That's Senator William Harrison. But this photo, this is impossible. According to every historical record, he was in Washington, D.C. that day, voting on the Enforcement Act. He couldn't have been here." Agent Chen moved with surprising speed, his hand covering the computer screen. "Dr. Morrison, I'm afraid this is now a matter of federal interest." But it was too late. The historian's trained eye had caught other details in the photographs. "Those aren't just bootleggers and federal agents in those photos," she continued, her professional demeanor cracking with excitement. "Those are members of the Shadow Council, a group that most historians believe was just a conspiracy theory. But if these photos are authentic, the agent's expression tightened. "Mr. Reeves, I need you to tell me exactly how you found these materials and who else knows about them." His tone was professional, but carried an undercurrent of urgency that made Tom's skin prickle. Tom looked at Marcus, who gave him a slight nod. The time for secrets was over. 3 days ago, the rain exposed a cellar entrance on my property," he began. "What we found inside, it's not just a bootlegger's hideout, it's an archive, a record of something, much bigger than Prohibition." He described the coded ledgers, the sophisticated communication system, the evidence of a vast network that had operated throughout the Northwest. With each detail, he watched Agent Chen's expression grow more concerned. "The Shadow Council wasn't a conspiracy theory," Tom concluded. "They were real, and this cellar was one of their intelligence-gathering stations. My grandfather, he was their keeper, wasn't he?" He directed this last question to Agent Chen, whose silence was answer enough. Dr. Morrison was practically vibrating with academic excitement. "Do you understand what this means? This completely rewrites our understanding of how power operated in the American Northwest during Prohibition. The official histories, the accepted narratives, are exactly what certain people wanted everyone to believe," Agent Chen interrupted. He turned to Tom. Mr. Reeves, your grandfather was part of something vital to national security, something that continued long after Prohibition ended, that safe in the cellar. Have you opened it? Tom shook his head, but his mind was racing. Back to the coded message in his grandfather's notebook. Look for the pattern, not the numbers. The symbol on the cellar door, repeated throughout the documents. It wasn't just a bootlegger's mark. It was a key. The crowd outside had grown larger. Local residents, drawn by the media presence, were gathering at the ranch's entrance. Tom could hear reporters doing live broadcasts, describing the scene unfolding. At the historic Reeves ranch, Sarah Martinez approached again, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. Tom, whatever's happening here, it doesn't change the fact that the bank's deadline is still in effect, but maybe we can discuss some options. Agent Chen cut her off. Ms. Martinez, I believe you'll be receiving some calls from our financial division shortly. The Reeves Ranch has just become a site of significant historical interest to the federal government. Tom's mind was spinning. In just 3 days, his quiet struggle to save the ranch had exploded into something he could never have imagined. But as he watched Agent Chen coordinating with his team, Dr. Morrison excitedly examining the photographs, and the media circus growing outside, he realized one thing was certain. His grandfather's prediction had been right. The time was finally here, and the truth about the Shadow Council was about to emerge, for better or worse. As the evening shadows lengthened across Whispering Pines Ranch, the true magnitude of what had begun with a simple eroded cellar door became clear. Agent Chen had established a temporary command center in Tom's office, his team efficiently setting up equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything the Historical Archives Division should possess. Your grandfather didn't just stumble upon this cellar, Mr. Reeves, Agent Chen explained, showing Tom a series of documents he'd retrieved from his vehicle. He was chosen to protect it. The Shadow Council didn't just disappear after Prohibition, they evolved. Dr. Morrison, who had been granted limited access to examine the photographic evidence, couldn't contain her excitement. The implications are staggering, she exclaimed, carefully handling another glass plate negative. These images prove that the entire accepted narrative of Western American development was orchestrated. The bootlegging operations were just a cover for something far more extensive. Tom watched as Agent Chen's team began cataloging the cellar's contents. Their equipment included what appeared to be advanced scanning technology capable of detecting hidden compartments and analyzing the chemical composition of the vintage bottles. But it was their reaction to the coded ledgers that caught his attention. These aren't just shipping records, one of the agents muttered, his handheld scanner beeping as it passed over a particular page. The encryption method. It's identical. The ones used in classified operations decades later. This shouldn't have existed in the 1920s. Marcus, who had been quietly observing everything, suddenly spoke up. The network's still active, isn't it? All eyes turned to him as he pulled out his grandfather's notebook. That's why you're really here. These stations, they're still being used. Agent Chen's slight hesitation before responding told Tom everything. Mr. Wheeler, you've just demonstrated why your grandfather trusted you with that notebook. Yes, the network evolved. What began as a way to monitor bootlegging operations became something far more crucial to national security. Dr. Morrison was practically bouncing with academic excitement as she connected more dots. The Shadow Council, they weren't just manipulating Prohibition, they were guiding the entire development of the Western United States. Look at these meeting minutes. She pointed to a newly decoded document. These men were planning infrastructure projects, industrial development, even water rights allocations that wouldn't be implemented for decades. But it was Tom's discovery that afternoon that truly revealed the scope of what they were dealing with. As Agent Chen's team worked to document the cellar's contents, Tom had been studying the pattern symbol that appeared throughout the documents. Something about its geometry had been nagging at his historian's mind. "It's not just a symbol," he announced, spreading out several photographs on his desk. "It's a map." Using overlays from different documents, he demonstrated how the intricate design, when properly oriented, aligned perfectly with key geographical features of the Northwest. Each line corresponds to a major transportation route, some of which didn't exist when these documents were created. Agent Chen's typically stoic expression cracked slightly. "Mr. Reeves, you're beginning to understand why this discovery is so sensitive. The Shadow Council wasn't just responding to history, they were planning it. This cellar contains evidence of decisions and developments that shaped the entire western United States." Sarah Martinez, who had been permitted to stay due to the bank's interest in the property, finally spoke up. "So, the Reeves Ranch, it wasn't just a random location?" "No," Agent Chen confirmed. "This property was chosen specifically for its strategic location. The cellar's position made it a perfect hub for the Council's monitoring activities. Your grandfather," he turned to Tom, "was part of a select group of ranchers and farmers whose properties served as cover for one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks ever created." As if to emphasize his point, one of the technicians called out from the cellar. They discovered another hidden compartment, this one containing what appeared to be early surveillance equipment, cameras and recording devices decades ahead of their time. But it was what they found behind the equipment that made everyone fall silent. A stack of photographs showed familiar Montana landscapes from the 1920s, but with inexplicable details. In the background of several images were structures and vehicles that seemed impossibly advanced for the era. "The Shadow Council," Dr. Morrison whispered, studying the photos. "They had access to technology that shouldn't have existed. These images, they suggest an entirely different level of technological development than what history records." Tom's mind was racing. The implications went far beyond historical revision. If these photographs were authentic, they suggested that the entire technological development of the 20th century had been carefully managed, with certain advancements held back or gradually released according to some master plan. The safe in the corner of the cellar seemed to pulse with new significance. What other secrets had his grandfather been protecting? The coded message about the pattern suddenly took on new meaning. It wasn't just about opening the safe. It was about understanding the larger design that the Shadow Council had been implementing for nearly a century. As night fell over Whispering Pines Ranch, the property had been transformed into a secure government facility. Floodlights illuminated the grounds as more federal vehicles arrived. The local media had been politely but firmly moved to the main road, their cameras capturing the unprecedented activity at the historic ranch. Tom stood with Marcus and Dr. Morrison, watching as another team of specialists arrived. "You realize," the historian said softly, "that once this becomes public, it changes everything. Not just our understanding of Prohibition, but our entire conception of how the modern American West was developed." Agent Chen approached them, his phone buzzing with incoming messages. "That's assuming it becomes public, Dr. Morrison. Some truths are too disruptive to be released all at once. Just ask Mr. Reeves's grandfather." He paused, studying Tom thoughtfully, as though perhaps the time he was waiting for has finally arrived. As midnight approached at Whispering Pines Ranch, a startling discovery in the cellar changed everything. One of Agent Chen's specialists, analyzing the vintage bottles with advanced scanning equipment, detected something extraordinary. The liquor wasn't just a cover for information trafficking. The bottles themselves were technological artifacts. "These aren't ordinary glass containers," the specialist explained, holding up one of the ornate bottles under specialized lighting. "The glass composition includes trace elements that shouldn't have been available in the 1920s. And look at these patterns in the glass structure." Tom leaned closer, his historian's training momentarily overwhelmed by what he was seeing. The bottle's surface, under magnification, revealed microscopic etchings, patterns that matched the larger symbol they'd found throughout the documents. But these weren't decorative. They appeared to be functional. They're data storage devices, Agent Chen confirmed, his typically guarded expression showing genuine amazement. The Shadow Council wasn't just running an intelligence network. They were using technology that we're only beginning to understand today. Dr. Morrison, who had been documenting everything with academic precision, suddenly made a connection that left everyone speechless. The bootlegging operation. It wasn't about the alcohol at all, was it? They needed a reason to transport these bottles across the country. The entire Prohibition era might have been engineered just to create a cover for moving this technology. Marcus, who had remained practical throughout all the revelations, spoke up from where he was examining his grandfather's notebook. "There's more," he said, holding the book under the specialized light. "The paper, it's got the same kind of markings. They're microscopic, but they're there. The notebook's pages, when examined under the government team's advanced equipment, revealed layers of hidden information encoded into the very fiber of the paper." Tom's grandfather hadn't just been taking notes. He'd been carrying around a sophisticated data storage device disguised as a simple rancher's journal. But it was what they found next that truly revealed the scope of what they were dealing with. As the team continued their analysis of the cellar's contents, they discovered that the telegraph system wasn't just advanced for its time, it was still operational. "These aren't telegraph wires," one of the technicians announced, tracing the connections that ran through the cellar walls. "They're some kind of fiber optic hybrid. They're carrying data right now." Agent Chen immediately ordered additional equipment brought in. When they connected modern interfaces to the century-old system, streams of encrypted data began flowing across their screens. The cellar wasn't just a historical site, it was an active node in a network that had been operating continuously for nearly 100 years. "Your grandfather," Agent Chen told Tom, "wasn't just a keeper of historical secrets. He was part of an ongoing operation that spans generations." The Shadow Council didn't just influence history, they were preparing for something. Dr. Morrison, analyzing the decoded data with growing excitement, pointed to recurring patterns in the information flow. "These aren't just intelligence reports, they're monitoring geological data, weather patterns, solar activity. This is far beyond what any historical organization should have been tracking." Tom's mind was racing as he cross-referenced the new information with the documents they'd already decoded, the infrastructure projects they planned, the technological developments they controlled. It wasn't just about power or influence. They were building something. The safe in the corner seemed to hum with new significance. The pattern they'd been seeing everywhere, on the bottles, in the documents, encoded into the notebook, wasn't just a symbol or a map. It was a key to understanding something far more profound. "Your grandfather's message about looking for the pattern, not the numbers," Marcus said, studying the safe with new understanding. He wasn't just talking about opening the safe. He was talking about seeing the bigger picture. As if in response to their growing understanding, the cellar's old systems began showing increased activity. The hidden fiber optic network pulsed. With data and their modern equipment struggled to process the surge of information. "Something's happening," Agent Chen announced, his phone buzzing with urgent messages. "We're picking up similar activity from other sites across the Northwest. Sites we thought were dormant for decades are coming online." Dr. Morrison, who had been cross-referencing the cellar's documents with known historical records, made another stunning connection. These other sites, they're all on properties owned by families with connections to the original Shadow Council, ranches, farms, small-town businesses. They created a whole network of seemingly ordinary places, all hiding technology that shouldn't have existed. The implications were staggering. The Shadow Council hadn't just been a Prohibition-era organization trying to control bootlegging. They had created a vast, hidden infrastructure throughout the American West, disguising advanced technology and data collection systems behind the facade of ordinary agricultural operations. Tom found himself looking at his family's ranch with new eyes. Every feature of the property, its location, the placement of buildings, even the patterns of land use, had been carefully planned. Whispering Pines wasn't just a ranch. It was a carefully crafted cover for something far more significant. As the government teams worked to process the flood of incoming data, Tom noticed something else. The pattern that appeared throughout the documents, when viewed from a certain angle, didn't just map the Northwest's transportation routes. It showed something else, what appeared to be energy flows or force lines crossing the landscape. They weren't just monitoring the region, he realized, spreading out maps marked with the recurring symbol. They were measuring something that's still active today. Agent Chen's phone buzzed again, this time with a message that made him pause. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice carrying new urgency, "I think it's time we open that safe. Whatever your grandfather was protecting, whatever the Shadow Council was preparing for, it's happening now." The moment of truth arrived with the first light of dawn. After hours of analyzing the pattern and its relationship to the safe's mechanism, Tom finally understood what his grandfather's message had meant. The combination wasn't a series of numbers. It was a sequence of positions that matched the energy flow lines shown in their maps. "Ready?" Agent Chen asked, his team positioned with scanning equipment aimed at the safe. Dr. Morrison stood ready with her camera, while Marcus held his grandfather's notebook open to the page containing the hidden pattern. The cellar's ancient monitoring systems hummed with increased activity, as if sensing the significance of the moment. Tom took a deep breath and began turning the dial. Instead of stopping at specific numbers, he followed the flow lines of the pattern, feeling subtle vibrations in the mechanism that corresponded to the map's energy points. The safe responded with a series of clicks that sounded nothing like normal tumbler movements. "That's not a standard locking mechanism," one of Chen's technical specialists observed. "The internal structure is far more complex than anything from the 1960s. With a final turn that completed the pattern, the safe door released with a soft hiss, as if breaking an airtight seal. Inside, they found something none of them had expected. Rather than documents or valuables, the safe contained what appeared to be a single technological device, unlike anything they'd ever seen. The object was about the size of a bread box, crafted from materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface bore the same pattern they'd seen throughout the cellar, but here it was, three-dimensional, seeming to shift and move as they watched. "Careful," Agent Chen warned as Tom reached for it. "We should scan it first." But before he could finish, the device responded to Tom's proximity. The pattern on its surface began to glow with a soft blue light, and a holographic display suddenly filled the cellar space. The display showed a map of the entire Northwest, but not as it appeared on any modern chart. Glowing lines of force crisscrossed the landscape, connecting points that corresponded perfectly with the locations of other Shadow Council sites. Whispering Pines Ranch sat at what appeared to be a major intersection of these energy flows. "My God," Dr. Morrison breathed, her academic composure cracking. "They weren't just monitoring the land, they were monitoring something fundamental about the Earth itself." The device projected more images, charts showing cycles of geological activity, solar radiation patterns, and what appeared to be long-term climate predictions spanning decades. But it was the next series of projections that left everyone speechless. "These are warning systems," Agent Chen said, his usual professional detachment slipping as he studied the displays. "The Shadow Council, they discovered something big enough to make them create this entire network." Tom's hands trembled as he examined the device more closely. "Look at these dates," He pointed to a sequence of projections. They start in the 1920s and go all the way to next month. Marcus, who had been quietly studying the holographic maps, suddenly made a connection. The weather patterns we've been having, the ones that expose the cellar, they're all predicted here, down to the exact day. But it was the final projection that revealed the true purpose of everything they'd discovered. The device showed a series of events scheduled to begin within weeks: geological shifts, atmospheric changes, and energy fluctuations that would affect the entire region. "That's why the network is activating now," Agent Chen said, rapidly sending messages on his secure phone. The Shadow Council wasn't just preserving history or gathering intelligence. They were preparing for something they knew would happen. Dr. Morrison, her historian's mind racing to process the implications, began connecting more dots. The infrastructure they developed, the technology they hid, the strategic placement of these monitoring stations, it was all designed to help navigate whatever's coming. Tom's grandfather's notebook suddenly took on new significance. The coded messages weren't just about protecting the cellar. They were instructions for when and how to use the hidden network when it was needed most. "Your grandfather knew," Agent Chen told Tom. "He knew the time would come when all of this would be necessary. That's why he left the clues, why he made sure you'd be here when it happened." The device continued projecting data, showing how the Shadow Council had spent nearly a century preparing for a series of events that were now imminent. Their bootlegging operations had funded the construction of a vast monitoring and response network. The technological innovations they'd developed hadn't just been about power or control. They were tools created for a specific purpose. "Look at these readings," one of Chen's specialists called out, examining data from other reactivated sites. "The entire network is synchronizing. Whatever they were preparing for, it's starting." Sarah Martinez, who had remained at the ranch due to the federal interest, approached Tom with a new document. "The bank's board just approved an immediate reclassification of your property. Whispering Pines Ranch is now designated as a site of critical historical and scientific importance." But Tom barely heard her. His attention was fixed on another holographic projection, one that showed Whispering Pines Ranch at the center of what was to come. His grandfather hadn't just protected the ranch by hiding this cellar. He'd ensured it would play a crucial role in whatever the Shadow Council had been preparing for. Agent Chen's phone buzzed with urgent messages from other sites. Similar devices are being found at other locations. The entire network, it's not just monitoring anymore. It's preparing to respond. As the morning sun rose over Whispering Pines Ranch, Tom realized that saving his family's property had become secondary to something far more significant. The Shadow Council's century-long secret was finally reaching its purpose, and his grandfather had ensured he would be there to help see it through. The device pulsed with another series of projections, showing events that would soon unfold across the Northwest. Whatever was coming, the Shadow Council had spent generations preparing for it. Now, standing in his grandfather's cellar, surrounded by technology that shouldn't exist and knowledge that would rewrite history, Tom understood why. The time had finally come. The transformation of Whispering Pines Ranch happened with breathtaking speed. Within hours of the safe's opening, the property had become the center of what Agent Chen called the most significant coordinated response operation in U.S. history. Military-grade communications equipment appeared in Tom's old barn, while teams of scientists and technicians converted his father's office into a sophisticated monitoring station. But it was the cellar that underwent the most dramatic change. The government teams had carefully integrated their modern technology with the Shadow Council's century-old systems, creating a hybrid command center that seemed to bridge past and future. The ancient telegraph-turned fiber optic network hummed, with constant activity as data flowed in from other activated sites across the northwest. "Look at these readings," Dr. Morrison called out, studying the holographic displays generated by the device from the safe. "The patterns your grandfather and the Shadow Council were tracking, they're intensifying. The energy flows through. The region are amplifying exactly as their models predicted." Tom watched as the three-dimensional map showed pulses of energy moving through the landscape, following the lines they'd discovered in the old documents. Whispering Pines Ranch sat at a crucial intersection of these flows, explaining why his great-grandfather had chosen this specific location when he first claimed the land. They weren't just ranchers, Tom realized, studying historical photographs with new understanding. Every generation of my family was positioned here for a reason. The cattle operation, the struggles to keep the ranch. It was all part of maintaining our presence at this exact spot. Marcus, who had been coordinating with other ranchers in the region, reported that similar discoveries were being made across the northwest. Other families are finding hidden chambers, old equipment, things that don't match up with the historical record. The Shadow Council, they built all of this right under everyone's nose. Agent Chen's team had decoded more of the device's projections, revealing the full scope of what the Shadow Council had been preparing for. "It's not just weather patterns or geological events," one specialist explained, pointing to overlapping data streams. They discovered cycles, patterns in the Earth's energy systems that build up and release over centuries. The implications were staggering. The Shadow Council hadn't just been a Prohibition-era secret society. They had been the guardians of crucial knowledge about Earth's fundamental systems. Their bootlegging operations, their influence over regional development, even Prohibition itself. All of it had been orchestrated to build and maintain a network designed for this moment. Your grandfather's generation knew they wouldn't see this themselves, Agent Chen told Tom, showing him newly decoded messages from the notebook. They were building something that wouldn't be needed for decades. That's why the secrecy was so important. They had to ensure everything would be preserved and ready when the time came. Dr. Morrison, who had been cross-referencing the Shadow Council's predictions with historical geological data, made another stunning discovery. These energy cycles, they correlate perfectly with major historical events, period of significant social change, technological advancement, even mass migrations. The Council wasn't just predicting the future, they were explaining the past. But it was the device's latest projections that demanded immediate attention. The holographic display showed energy buildups occurring at specific points throughout the Northwest, precisely where the Shadow Council had positioned their monitoring stations. Whispering Pines Ranch's position at a major intersection meant it would be crucial in managing whatever was coming. "The network isn't just for monitoring," one of Chen's technical specialists announced, studying the ancient systems. "It's designed to help channel and redirect these energy flows." The Shadow Council built a management system into the landscape itself. Sarah Martinez, still present as the bank's representative, watched in amazement as government teams installed additional equipment in the old barn. "When you said you had a plan to save the ranch," she said to Tom, shaking her head in disbelief, "I didn't exactly expect this." The device suddenly pulsed with new information, projecting a countdown sequence that made Agent Chen's team spring into action. "Energy buildups are accelerating," one specialist reported. "The patterns are matching the Council's 100-year-old predictions exactly." Tom felt the weight of generations as he watched the activity unfold around him. His grandfather's last message made perfect sense now. Look for the pattern, not the numbers. The Shadow Council hadn't just been leaving clues. They had been teaching their descendants to recognize and understand the fundamental patterns that shaped the region's destiny. As if to confirm their discoveries, the first physical signs began to appear. Subtle vibrations ran through the ground, too slight to be normal seismic activity, but powerful enough to register on the Council's ancient monitoring equipment. The energy flows visible in their holographic displays began to pulse with increasing intensity. Multiple stations reporting similar phenomena, Agent Chen announced, coordinating with other sites. The network is responding exactly as designed. Whatever the Shadow Council was preparing for, it's beginning. Dr. Morrison, her historian's excitement tempered by the gravity of the situation, summed up what they were all thinking. For 100 years they created this elaborate cover story. Bootlegging, secret societies, hidden technology, all of it designed to put these stations in place and keep them safe until they were needed. And now the device pulsed again, its holographic display showing energy patterns converging on their location. The ancient equipment in the cellar hummed, in harmony with the modern systems, creating a symphony of technology that spanned a century. Whatever was coming, Whispering Pines Ranch was about to become far more than just a historical curiosity. "Your grandfather was right," Agent Chen told Tom, watching as more government vehicles arrived at the ranch. "The time is finally here, and thanks to the Shadow Council's preparations, we might just be ready for it." The climactic moment at Whispering Pines Ranch arrived with the first light of dawn 3 days after opening the safe. The device's predictions had been precise. Energy buildups throughout the Northwest had reached critical levels, and the Shadow Council's century-old network was humming with activity. What happened next would validate every preparation they had made. Multiple stations reporting unprecedented readings, one of Chen's specialists announced, monitoring data streams from across the region. The holographic display showed pulses of energy converging on key points throughout the Northwest, exactly as the Shadow Council had predicted 100 years ago. Tom stood in the transformed cellar, watching as both ancient and modern equipment responded to the growing phenomenon. The pattern they'd found throughout the documents was now visible in real time. Energy flows following the exact paths the Council had mapped nearly a century before. "Your grandfather's generation knew exactly what they were preparing for," Agent Chen said, showing Tom newly decoded data from the device. "They didn't just predict these energy convergences, they built a system to harness them." Dr. Morrison, who had been correlating historical events with the energy patterns, made a breakthrough that left everyone speechless. "The Shadow Council didn't just discover these cycles," she explained, spreading out documents from the 1920s. "They learned how to use them. Look at the timing of major technological advancements, social changes, even economic developments in the region. They were all guided by these energy flows." The device suddenly pulsed with new urgency, its holographic display showing energy patterns intensifying around Whispering Pines Ranch. The ground beneath them vibrated with subtle but persistent tremors, and the air seemed to crackle with invisible force. "All stations reporting ready," Chen's team announced. The network of sites across the Northwest, hidden for decades beneath ordinary farms and ranches, had synchronized their ancient equipment with modern systems. The Shadow Council's preparations were about to be put to their intended use. Marcus, who had been monitoring communications from other ranches, reported something extraordinary. The cattle, they're responding to it, not just here but everywhere in the region. They're moving into formation, following the energy lines we mapped. Tom rushed to the barn's upper window. Sure enough, his herd had arranged itself in a pattern that perfectly matched the energy flows shown in their holographic displays. The animals stood calmly, as if they'd been trained for this moment through generations of selective breeding. "Your family's breeding program," Dr. Morrison realized, checking old ranch records. The traits they selected for, they weren't just about beef quality or hardiness. They were developing livestock that could sense and respond to these energy patterns. The device's displays suddenly shifted, showing energy convergences reaching critical levels. The ancient equipment in the cellar activated fully, mechanisms that hadn't moved in decades, coming to life with precision that seemed impossible for their age. "This is it," Agent Chen announced, coordinating with other sites. "The network is engaging exactly as the Council designed. Whatever they built this for, it's happening now." The sky above Whispering Pines Ranch took on an unusual quality, colors shifting in ways that defied normal atmospheric conditions. The energy patterns visible in their displays were now manifesting in the physical world, creating phenomena that would have seemed impossible just days ago. "The Shadow Council didn't just predict this," Tom said, understanding finally dawning. "They weren't just preparing to observe it, they were preparing to guide it." He pointed to patterns in the old documents that suddenly made sense. These weren't just monitoring stations, they're control points. As if in response to his realization, the device projected new information, detailed instructions for using the network to channel and direct the converging energy flows. The Shadow Council had spent a century positioning these stations precisely where they would be needed to manage this moment. "Your grandfather protected more than just historical secrets," Agent Chen told Tom, watching as the ancient systems interfaced perfectly with their modern equipment. "He preserved the knowledge and tools needed for this exact scenario." The energy patterns intensified, creating visible distortions in the air above the ranch. But unlike the chaos that might have been expected, the network responded with coordinated precision. The Shadow Council's stations, hidden for decades beneath ordinary rural properties, worked in perfect harmony to channel and direct the unprecedented forces. Dr. Morrison, documenting everything with academic rigor, couldn't contain her amazement. "They built all of this, the bootlegging operations, the secret society, the hidden technology, just to ensure these stations would be in exactly the right places at exactly the right time." Sarah Martinez, who had remained to represent the bank's interests, watched in awe as the sky above the ranch shifted with colors that shouldn't have been possible. "I think we can safely say the property's value has increased significantly," she managed, trying to maintain professional composure in the face of the extraordinary. The device's holographic display showed energy flows being successfully channeled through the network, following paths the Shadow Council had designed a century ago. What could have been catastrophic was instead being transformed into something controlled, even beneficial. They weren't just trying to prevent a disaster, Tom realized watching the patterns unfold. They were preparing to harness this energy, to use it for something. He pointed to projections showing the aftermath of the convergence, patterns of renewal and growth spreading throughout the region. As the energy peaked, the combined technology of past and present worked flawlessly together. The Shadow Council's century of preparation proved its worth as the network channeled and transformed forces that could have devastated the Northwest into something that would instead revitalize it. "Your family didn't just protect this land," Agent Chen told Tom as they watched the extraordinary display. "They were guardians of something far more important, and now we know why the time had to be right, why this had to be preserved until exactly this moment." In the hours following the energy convergence, Whispering Pines Ranch became the focal point of an extraordinary transformation. The successfully channeled energy had left its mark not just on the landscape, but on everything it touched. The morning sun revealed changes that defied conventional explanation. "The soil composition is completely altered," reported one of Chen's environmental specialists, examining readings from across the property. "The molecular structure has been enhanced, showing unprecedented levels of fertility and mineral content. The pastures that had been struggling under years of drought now hummed with renewed vitality. Tom's cattle herd, which had maintained their peculiar formation throughout the event, showed remarkable changes. Their genetic markers are showing subtle but significant improvements, a veterinary scientist announced, studying rapid test results. The Shadow Council wasn't just breeding them to sense these energies. They were preparing them to be transformed by them. Dr. Morrison, who had been documenting everything with meticulous detail, made another stunning connection. "Look at these dates in the Council's records," she said, pointing to entries from the 1920s. They didn't just predict this convergence, they orchestrated everything, the bootlegging, the property acquisitions, even Prohibition itself, to ensure these exact bloodlines would be here at this precise moment. The device from the safe continued projecting data, but now it showed something new. A cascade of changes spreading outward from each Shadow Council site across the Northwest. The network hadn't just prevented a catastrophe, it had initiated a carefully planned renewal. The energy patterns are stabilizing, Agent Chen's team reported, monitoring both modern and ancient equipment. But they're not dissipating. They're being absorbed into the landscape itself, exactly as the Council's documents predicted. Marcus, who had been coordinating with other ranches in the network, brought reports that echoed their own observations. Every site is showing the same changes. Soil improvement, strengthened livestock, even changes in the local water tables. It's like the whole region is being enhanced. But it was what they discovered next that revealed the true scope of the Shadow Council's vision. The device projected a new series of maps showing how the transformed properties would affect everything around them. The enhanced soil wouldn't stay contained, it would gradually spread, improving agricultural conditions throughout the Northwest. They didn't just plan for one event, Tom realized, studying his grandfather's coded notes with new understanding. They were initiating a process. These stations aren't just control points, they're seed sites for widespread environmental regeneration. The sophisticated monitoring equipment in the cellar confirmed his theory. The energy patterns, now stabilized, had begun establishing permanent flows between the network sites. Each property would serve as a hub, gradually extending the enhancement effect to surrounding areas. "Your family's breeding program makes perfect sense now," Dr. Morrison said, examining historical ranch records. "You weren't just developing cattle that could survive in harsh conditions. You were creating bloodlines that would help spread these improvements naturally through the region's livestock population." Sarah Martinez, who had been making calls to her bank's senior management, approached Tom with a stack of new documents. "The federal government has officially designated Whispering Pines Ranch as a site of critical agricultural significance," she announced. "They're establishing a permanent research station here, with funding that will ensure the ranch's operation for generations to come." Agent Chen, coordinating with other government agencies, confirmed the broader implications. What's happening here isn't just a local phenomenon. The Shadow Council created a template that could be replicated across the country. They weren't just saving the Northwest, they were developing a system that could regenerate agricultural land nationwide. The device's projections showed the next phase of the Council's plan unfolding. The energy convergence had been just the beginning. The network would continue working, gradually expanding its influence until the entire region had been transformed. "Your grandfather didn't just protect these secrets," Chen told Tom, watching. As more government scientists arrived to study the changes, he preserved the knowledge that could help address some of our most pressing agricultural challenges. Tom found himself looking at his family legacy with new appreciation. The struggles to keep the ranch, the carefully maintained breeding programs, even his own academic background in history, all of it had been preparation for this moment. Inside the cellar, the merged technologies of past and present continued their work. The Shadow Council's century-old equipment, now fully integrated with modern systems, monitored the ongoing transformation with unwavering precision. "Look at these energy signatures," one of Chen's specialists called out, studying the latest. And data. They're not just random patterns anymore. They're organizing themselves into stable configurations. The network isn't just managing the energy, it's teaching it new behaviors. Dr. Morrison, correlating the changes with historical records, found yet another layer to the Council's planning. These enhancement patterns, they match perfectly with ancient agricultural practices we've never fully understood. The Council didn't invent this system, they rediscovered it and found a way to amplify it using modern technology. As the sun set on another extraordinary day at Whispering Pines Ranch, the full scope of what had been set in motion was still unfolding. The Shadow Council's century of preparation had created something unprecedented, a self-sustaining system for agricultural and environmental enhancement that would continue working long after its activation. But as Tom studied the device's latest projections, he realized they were still missing something crucial. The patterns it showed weren't just about agricultural improvement, they hinted at something even more significant. Whatever the Shadow Council had ultimately been preparing for, this transformation was just the first phase of a much larger plan. 1 week after the energy convergence, a startling discovery in the cellar changed their understanding of everything they thought they knew. One of Agent Chen's specialists, analyzing data patterns from the device, detected something extraordinary hidden within the energy signatures themselves. These aren't just environmental enhancement patterns, the specialist explained, highlighting complex sequences in the holographic display. There's another layer of information encoded within them, the agricultural improvements. They're just a carrier signal for something much more sophisticated. Tom's attention snapped to the display as new patterns emerged from the data. The device was now showing energy configurations that seemed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. The visible transformations they'd witnessed across the ranch were just the surface of something far more profound. "Look at this," Dr. Morrison called out, correlating the new patterns with previously decoded documents. The Shadow Council wasn't just predicting energy convergences. They discovered something fundamental about the nature of reality itself. These patterns, they're templates for restructuring matter at its most basic level. Agent Chen quickly ordered additional security measures around the cellar. "This goes beyond agricultural enhancement," he said, studying the new data streams. The Council wasn't just trying to improve farming conditions. They were laying the groundwork for something that could change everything we think we know about physics. The device projected a series of interlocking patterns that seemed to describe a completely new understanding of how energy and matter interact. The agricultural network they'd activated wasn't just transforming the soil and livestock, it was establishing the conditions necessary for something far more significant. "Your grandfather's last message," Marcus said suddenly, holding up his notebook. The part about the pattern being more important than the numbers. He wasn't just talking about the safe combination. He was trying to tell us that the visible changes were just indicators of the real transformation. The cellar's ancient equipment, still perfectly synchronized with modern technology, began displaying readings that challenged their understanding of what was possible. The energy patterns flowing through the network weren't just enhancing natural processes, they were introducing entirely new ones. These signatures, one of Chen's quantum physics specialists announced, examining the data. They're showing qualities we've only theorized about in advanced physics laboratories. The Council somehow developed practical applications for principles we're only beginning to understand today. Dr. Morrison, who had been cross-referencing the new patterns with historical documents, made another stunning connection. The bootlegging operation, the sophisticated bottles, the communication network. It wasn't just about moving information. They were testing these principles on a small scale, preparing for this moment. Tom found himself looking at his family's breeding program in an entirely new light. The cattle weren't just being bred to sense these energies, he realized. They were being prepared to serve as living conduits for these new patterns. Every generation was slightly more adapted to interface with whatever the council was developing. The device suddenly projected a new series of instructions, showing how the network sites were meant to work together in ways they hadn't anticipated. Each location wasn't just a point for channeling energy. It was part of a vast array designed to fundamentally alter the properties of space-time itself. "The Shadow Council," Agent Chen said, watching the patterns unfold. They weren't just a group of forward-thinking individuals trying to protect the future. They were scientists who discovered something so profound they had to hide it within seemingly ordinary operations until humanity was ready to understand it. Sarah Martinez, still present as the bank's representative, watched in amazement as the device showed the next phase of the council's plan. "When you said the property had hidden value," she remarked to Tom, "I don't think anyone could have imagined this." The implications were staggering. The network of sites across the Northwest wasn't just designed to enhance agriculture, it was establishing a framework for implementing physical principles that could revolutionize human understanding of the universe. "Look at these energy configurations," one of the specialists called out. "They're not just affecting matter, they're affecting the fundamental forces that govern reality." The council found a way to influence the basic structure of existence itself. Tom's historian's training helped him see the bigger picture. "They couldn't reveal this all at once," he said, studying the progression of events in the council's records. "They had to prepare the ground literally and figuratively. The agricultural improvements, the environmental enhancement, it's all about getting people ready to accept bigger changes." The device's projections showed the next phase beginning to unfold. The stable energy patterns they'd established weren't just maintaining the improvements, they were laying the groundwork for something even more extraordinary. Dr. Morrison, analyzing the latest data, found patterns that corresponded with ancient symbols and structures around the world. The council didn't invent this, she realized. They rediscovered something that might have been known to ancient civilizations, something that was lost or hidden until they found a way to implement it using modern technology. As night fell over Whispering Pines Ranch, the cellar hummed with energy as both ancient and modern equipment processed the continuing transformations. The Shadow Council's century of preparation hadn't just been about saving agriculture or preventing disaster. They had been methodically establishing the conditions necessary for humanity to take an evolutionary leap in understanding and capability. But even as they grappled with these revelations, Tom noticed something in the device's latest projections that suggested they still hadn't uncovered the Council's ultimate purpose. The patterns were showing configurations that hinted at possibilities beyond anything they'd imagined. Possibilities that would challenge not just science, but humanity's entire conception of reality. 10 days after the initial energy convergence, the true magnitude of what had begun at Whispering Pines Ranch became clear. The device from the safe had started displaying patterns that went beyond anything they'd anticipated, revealing layers of information that challenged the very foundations of modern science. "These aren't just physics principles," announced Dr. Emily Chen, a quantum mechanics specialist who'd been called in by Agent Chen. "The Shadow Council discovered something that unifies all natural forces, not just the ones we know about, but ones we haven't even detected yet." The holographic displays filled the cellar with intricate patterns that seemed to describe the underlying structure of reality itself. The agricultural transformations they'd witnessed were just the most visible manifestation of something far more profound. "Look at this sequence," Tom said, pointing to a recurring pattern in the projections. "It appears in everything, the soil samples, the cattle's genetic changes, even the energy signatures themselves. It's like they found nature's source code. Dr. Morrison, who had been correlating the new data with ancient texts, made a breakthrough that left everyone speechless. The Shadow Council didn't just discover this by accident, she explained, spreading out documents from various historical periods. They found references to this knowledge in civilizations throughout history. Prohibition wasn't just about controlling alcohol. It was about creating the conditions necessary to rebuild this ancient understanding. The device suddenly projected a new series of images that showed how the network sites were meant to work together in their next phase. Each location wasn't just channeling energy, it was helping to establish a new fundamental frequency throughout the region. The breeding programs, the property locations, even the specific materials used in construction, everything was chosen to resonate with these frequencies, Agent Chen explained, watching as new data streamed in from other sites. They spent a century fine-tuning every detail. Marcus, studying his grandfather's notebook with fresh understanding, found encoded messages that took on new significance. They knew this would happen in stages, he said, decoding another hidden note. The agricultural changes were just phase 1. They're preparing us for something much bigger. The CELLAR's hybrid command center, where ancient technology worked seamlessly with modern equipment, began detecting changes that defied conventional explanation. The energy patterns weren't just affecting physical matter, they were altering the fundamental properties of space and time around the network. "Zeitz, these readings are impossible," one of Chen's specialists announced, checking and rechecking their instruments. "We're seeing localized variations in what we thought were universal constants. The Council didn't just find a way to enhance nature. They found a way to rewrite its basic rules." Sarah Martinez, who had been coordinating with national agricultural authorities, brought reports that highlighted the expanding impact. "The enhanced properties aren't just spreading through soil and livestock," she explained. "They're affecting everything in the region. Water systems, atmospheric conditions, even electromagnetic fields." But it was Tom's discovery that revealed the true scope of the Council's vision. Studying the device's latest projections, he noticed something in the pattern sequences that changed everything. "These aren't just formulas for transforming matter," he said, his voice filled with awe. "They're instructions for accessing higher dimensions of reality." Dr. Morrison quickly confirmed his theory, finding correlations in ancient texts from multiple cultures. "Every major civilization has myths about moments when humanity made quantum leaps in understanding," she explained. The Shadow Council found scientific evidence that these weren't just legends. The device's projections showed how the network sites were creating stable points of contact with these higher dimensions. The ancient equipment, designed and positioned decades ago, had been crafted to handle energies that modern science was only beginning to theorize about. "Your grandfather and his contemporaries," Agent Chen told Tom, "they weren't just trying to protect agricultural land or preserve historical secrets. They were preparing humanity for contact with aspects of reality we're only now becoming capable of comprehending." The implications were staggering. The Shadow Council hadn't just been a secret organization operating during Prohibition. They had been the guardians of knowledge that could fundamentally change humanity's relationship with the universe itself. As the enhanced patterns continued spreading through the region, they began seeing effects that went beyond physical transformation. People living near the network sites reported increased intuitive abilities, deeper connection with their environment, and understanding of principles that should have been beyond their comprehension. "The Council knew this would happen," Dr. Morrison said, finding predictions in their century-old documents. "They weren't just preparing the land, they were preparing human consciousness itself for an evolutionary leap." Tom's family's role in all of this took on new significance. The ranching operation, the financial struggles, even my academic career, It was all designed to ensure someone with the right combination of practical and theoretical knowledge would be here when this began. The device suddenly displayed a new series of projections that showed the next phase of activation approaching. The network wasn't just establishing contact with higher dimensions, it was preparing to stabilize these connections permanently. Whatever they discovered, Agent Chen said, watching the patterns evolve, whatever they spent a century preparing for, it's bigger than national security, bigger than scientific advancement. They found something that could change the very nature of human existence. As night fell over Whispering Pines Ranch, the cellar hummed with energy as both ancient and modern equipment processed the continuing transformations. But even as they marveled at what they'd discovered, Tom noticed something in the device's latest projections that suggested the Shadow Council's ultimate revelation was still to come. The patterns were showing configurations that hinted at a truth so profound it would shake the foundations of human understanding. The next phase was about to begin, and what they would learn would make everything they'd discovered so far seem like just the beginning. 2 weeks after Tom Reeves first discovered the mysterious cellar beneath his struggling ranch, the Shadow Council's century-old plan reached its culmination. The transformation began at dawn, as the device from the safe projected its most extraordinary display yet. A complete revelation of why the Council had spent generations preparing for this moment. "It's beautiful," Dr. Morrison whispered, watching as the holographic patterns filled the cellar with crystalline structures of pure energy. The display showed not just the physical world, but layers of reality that had always existed alongside it, invisible until now. They didn't just find a way to enhance agriculture or tap into higher dimensions, Tom realized, studying the patterns with newfound understanding. They discovered that consciousness itself is the fundamental force of the universe. Everything, else matter, energy, even time, they're all expressions of it. The network sites across the Northwest had been positioned to create what the device now revealed as a vast consciousness-amplifying array. The agricultural improvements, the enhanced livestock, the altered soil composition, all of it had been preparation for this moment of awakening. Your grandfather's generation knew humanity wasn't ready for this knowledge all at once, Agent Chen explained, showing Tom newly decoded messages from the Council's archives. They had to guide us through stages of understanding, using things we could accept, like agricultural innovation, to prepare us for bigger revelations. The device's projections showed how the Shadow Council had discovered this truth during Prohibition. Their bootlegging operations hadn't just been cover for moving information. They'd been experimenting with consciousness-affecting substances, trying to understand how human awareness could interface with higher dimensions of reality. "Look at these formulas," Dr. Emily Chen pointed out, examining the complex patterns. They're not just describing physical transformations. They're showing how consciousness can directly influence the structure of reality itself. The Council found scientific proof of what mystics have claimed for millennia. Marcus, who had been monitoring the ranch's enhanced cattle, reported something extraordinary. The animals weren't just sensing the energy patterns anymore. They were actively participating in them, their collective consciousness becoming part of the larger network the Council had designed. "Every living thing is connected," Tom said, watching as the patterns showed webs of awareness linking all life in the region. The Council didn't just build a physical network, they created a framework for expanding consciousness itself. The cellar's hybrid command center hummed with unprecedented activity as both ancient and modern equipment registered the final phase beginning. The energy patterns that had been spreading through the region were now cohering into what the device showed as a new layer of reality, one that humanity was finally ready to perceive and interact with. This is why they chose rural properties, especially ranches, Dr. Morrison explained, finding confirmation in the historical documents. They needed locations where people maintained direct connection with the land, where the link between consciousness and nature remained strong. Sarah Martinez, still present as everything unfolded, watched in amazement as the device showed the economic implications of what was happening. They knew this would change everything, not just agriculture, but how humans interact with the entire world. The transformation accelerated as morning progressed. The network sites, acting in perfect harmony, established permanent connections with the higher dimensions the Council had discovered. But it wasn't just the land or the technology that was changing. Human consciousness itself was beginning to resonate with these new frequencies. Your family wasn't just protecting secrets, Agent Chen told Tom, watching as the patterns revealed the full scope of the Council's plan. They were custodians of humanity's next evolutionary step. The ranch, the cattle, the financial struggles. Everything was designed to ensure the right conditions would exist for this moment. The device's final projections showed what the Shadow Council had been working toward, a permanent elevation of human awareness, allowing people to consciously participate in the forces that shape reality itself. The agricultural network wasn't just about improving farming. It was about re-establishing humanity's lost connection with the fundamental consciousness that underlies all existence. They didn't just find this knowledge, Dr. Morrison said, correlating the patterns with ancient texts. They rediscovered what humanity once knew, what was lost over thousands of years, and they found a way to restore it using modern science. As the transformation reached its peak, the effects became undeniable. People throughout the region reported expanded awareness, deeper understanding, and direct perception of the energy patterns the Council had mapped a century ago. The network wasn't just changing the physical world, it was awakening humanity's dormant potential to interact with all levels of reality. Tom stood in his great-grandfather's cellar, watching as the device showed the completion of what generations of his family had helped prepare. The struggling ranch that had seemed destined for foreclosure had become the focal point of humanity's greatest advancement, not through technology alone, but through the marriage of science and consciousness itself. Your grandfather was right, Agent Chen said, as the final patterns locked into place. The time had to be exactly right. Humanity needed to reach a point where we could understand what the Council discovered without being destroyed by it. The transformation that had begun with a mysterious cellar door exposed by rain had culminated in something far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The Shadow Council's true legacy wasn't just the preservation of secret knowledge or the development of advanced technology. It was preparing humanity for a leap in consciousness that would forever change our relationship with reality itself. As the sun set on Whispering Pines Ranch that evening, the device's final projection showed what lay ahead. A future where humanity would consciously participate in the forces that shape existence, guided by the understanding that consciousness itself is the foundation of all reality. The century of preparation, the elaborate deceptions, the careful positioning of people and resources, all of it had served to bring humanity to this threshold of transformation. Tom's failing ranch had become something far more significant than a historical site or scientific curiosity. It was now a gateway to humanity's next great adventure, one that would unite science and consciousness in ways the Shadow Council had foreseen 100 years ago. The mystery that began in a Montana ranch cellar had become a beacon of awakening, reminding us that the greatest discoveries often come disguised in the most ordinary places, waiting for the right moment to reveal their extraordinary truth. If you've been moved by this incredible story of discovery and transformation, make Sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing revelations. Share your thoughts in the comments below about how you think this discovery will change our understanding of reality itself. Remember, sometimes the most profound truths are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to emerge.